People want healthy forests. People want clean water. They want wildlife to be abundant. They don't want forest fires, even more than they don't want carbon emissions in the atmosphere they can't see. So I think we can change this, but we have to stop seeing it through a partisan lens. We have to stop seeing it through a political lens because it is breaking us. We only have so much and we all share it together. And if everyone loves national parks and everyone's going to these public lands every summer and the visitation's at an all-time high and Yellowstone's the most popular show and everyone cares about watching the docuseries Planet Earth and taking their kids to aquariums and zoos to see animals because wildlife is so amazing, then we should probably stand together to protect that place because that's what we have.
Benji, how did you become an environmentalist?
Grew up in Wisconsin and loved the outdoors from a young age. My parents were always spending time in nature with us. So all of our free time was spent in the Northwoods of Wisconsin. We had a little cabin on a lake. Really got connected with like bugs. Like I loved bugs when I was little and still do, but I also like bigger animals now. Definitely just had an affinity to the outdoors because of my family, for sure.
Why do you think the environment's become a political issue at all?
I mean, it used to not be a political issue. In the 1970s, Richard Nixon created the EPA, signed the Clean Air Act, signed the Clean Water Act. There was a massive national outcry for environmental protection across the spectrum. You had everyone from coal miners in Ohio and LA urbanites all pushing for better air quality and water quality. Unlike most issues that are sort of like newer issues, this is a long-standing nonpartisan issue. However, I think every issue is now seen as political by everyone. I mean, COVID was political, climate change is political, books in schools is political, and obviously it always has been that way in a small way, but it was always about like debating solutions rather than debating the problem. So we got caught up in a culture war, I think partially because of just how tribal politics has become, which I think we will turn that around. I think at some point this tribalism breaks the country, hopefully not in a way that's really harmful, but it is going to break at some point. But I also think Al Gore was the first turning point for it, not to blame him intentionally, but when the face of the movement became the Democratic leader, people started to associate environmental policy with somebody they didn't like.
Right.
So now when I go to conservative communities, they don't see solar panels or windmills or electric vehicles as environmental things. They see it as a Democrat thing. That started to happen in the early 2000s. I think it was kind of both of those things.
The environment is such a hard thing to work on. It just seems like the right thing to do. It's like an old values thing, like that predates any Democrat or Republican kind of thing. I mean, I think it's pretty simple. You just want to leave the place better than when you found it. Sort of tend the garden as much as you can. I saw you speaking and you were talking about the difference between somebody from one of the coasts and somebody in the middle of the country maybe having different ways of caring about different aspects of it. But it doesn't seem like it should be very controversial to keep it together for future generations, but it does seem hard. Also, we hear these statistics about we do all this saving, we're trying to do the right thing, right cars, whatever. And then you hear that China is polluting at this incredible level, and it sort of gives you a feeling of hopelessness, at least for me. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, first of all, I think we have, on the first point, we've definitely decreased the personal agency that people have when it comes to the environment. It's not place-based anymore. It's about polar bears and ice caps and carbon emissions, which you can't even see, and feel. It's not about the Cuyahoga River or the LA smog or the Great Salt Lake or the Everglades or these places that are having environmental degradation and are at risk, right, all the time. That's not what it's about. It's about, but that's what it should be about, right? It should be about the places that people care about. And, of course, if you ask somebody, do you care about polar bears? They're going to say yes. But do they care as much about polar bears as they do their backyards? Absolutely not. And so that's where that kind of broke down. But I also think because China and India are growing so rapidly and they are increasing their environmental impact every single day, there was this kind of, hey, America, you need to do X, Y, and Z to care about the environment. You might need to pay more. You might need to do more. You might need to change your entire lifestyle. And then people are like, but wait a second, what I do doesn't matter when these other countries are exponentially increasing their emissions. And I think that also turned people away from being part of the solution, when in reality, we want to be a leader. We want to show the rest of the world how to do things, and we want to help be a model. But that's not how it was pitched. It was kind of like, you're guilty, you should be ashamed of how you live. Meanwhile, we were going to completely ignore that other countries are doing X, Y, and Z. So it's almost like a middle school game at this point, where people are saying, hey, you suck, you need to do something completely different. The other people are going the other way and saying, I'm not going to do anything because you're telling me how to live my life, and they're doing something worse than I am, so I'm not going to stop doing. It's very dramatic and unnecessary. But it goes back to my initial point, which is that if you can bring people back to the environment in a way that connects them with their local community, that's the answer. Because I don't think it's fair to expect someone to care about what's happening thousands of miles away as much as they care about their own backyards, at least. And people only have so much time in the day to care about different issues. So growing up in the Midwest, the pollution in the Great Lakes meant a lot to the people who lived in that area because it affected their day-to-day lives. And so if you asked them to take action for that, they would sign up really quickly. But if you asked them to take action against sea level rise to coasts that were happening thousands of miles away, they'd be like, sure, that sounds bad, sounds rough, but that doesn't affect me. Environmentalism used to be about your local environment, right? People were acting for their own communities. And I think if we bring that back, you're going to find a lot of really unlikely allies.
There's almost this cognitive dissonance, or this level to which we're not cooperative with other people because of their political, we can't agree on anything. A place like the Nature Conservancy, we worked on a project for them. There was a salmon fleet that was out, and they were fishing out everything in the Pacific Northwest. And the people would say, well, we have to make a living. We can't care about this because of something else. But they were going to fish them out and kill every fish. And so what they did was, very quietly, they just bought the fishing fleet, and then leased the boats back to the fishermen, with the one condition that they just fish sustainably, right? It was not an obvious solution. It was a creative solution. I don't know who there thought of it, but it seems like with environment, we need that kind of thinking. And, stereotypically, like a Democrat would have a progressive idea, a conservative would say, okay, great, how are you going to pay for it? And that seems embodied in that collaboration within the Nature Conservancy. How do we impart that sort of, or is it even necessary to impart it beyond a way of us communicating with other people? Is there a way of in getting this thinking to be non-political? Because I don't think, I'm not sure whether that was the best idea or not the best idea, but it did address the central point that we can't kill every fish, and it did address the idea that the fisherman needs to make money,
Yeah, and I do agree that there's a way to take politics out of the environment. Not that politics isn't a tool to get to the results that we need, right? We need to use politics in that way, but politics is not the end all be all for everything when it comes to environmental issues, and that we don't need to always be thinking about lobbying and everything. We need to be thinking about, how do we help these communities transition to things that make them more efficient and more environmentally conscious without hurting their lives? Like, if you're a farmer in the Midwest, you're just trying to feed your family and feed the world, but also specifically feed your family. If we're telling them, oh, you need to change all your agriculture practices, and you're draining too much water here, and you need to recycle water better here, and you can't use these things in your crops and all that stuff, you're going to receive a lot of pushback from that entire community. But if they feel like there's some sort of incentive or way that they can benefit from it, and it doesn't even have to be monetarily, like they will get extra support for their farm in certain ways, or their community will be developed in certain ways, like they will buy into it. It's understanding what people need and trying to help work with them on the solution. And that's kind of the whole idea around what the Nature Conservancy did there, which is like, hey, look, we're not going to let you overfish everything, but we are going to help you in some other way, because there's a reason they're overfishing, right? There's a reason they're doing that, and it's to help themselves economically. So how can we change the pathway of how these people can survive without telling them that they can't survive, or that they need to just figure it out on their own? So Politics is a tool, but politics as we think about it, that's not how we solve it. Social media influencers, or like the way that we think about politics, is so jaded today. And if we think about the environment within that context, people are going to turn the other way. But that's not where the environment needs to be solved. It needs to be solved in each community by each community. And it sounds kind of cliche to say that, but it's true. I mean, I live in Arizona, and I've lived in Seattle, and I've lived in Wisconsin, and the different ways to tackle challenges in each one of these places is so different. It's like astronomically different. And so if you work with the community rather than telling the community what to do, or that like, oh, you just can't fish anymore, like that would really prevent a lot of allyship at the level that you need. But if you say, hey, we're going to help you continue to fish, but we're going to help you do it in a more sensible, sustainable way, and we're going to help you survive outside of that, then you're going to get the buy-in that you need.
How do you have like personal experiences going into communities specifically? Okay, let's say Arizona. And by the way, let's give a little context. What are the different issues facing those places? Because that's a really interesting and it's important. So what are the three? Wisconsin, Washington, Arizona. What are the three?
Yeah, it's a good kind of microcosm of the entire country. So Arizona has smog because there's an inversion here where the air just kind of sits from the cars and the different manufacturing facilities out here. So there's air pollution. There's a lack of water, obviously, and infrastructure for water because it's so dry. And there's also water quality issues because it's not like a natural source here locally. So that's kind of the Arizona environmental issue. The Washington environmental issues are salmon are struggling. There's wildfires putting the area at risk. Glaciers are melting faster, so there's not as much snow melt, which is affecting crops because a lot of farms are using the natural water sources. So that's changing the different cycles there. And there's a lot of farming actually in Washington that is being affected by changing weather patterns. And then in Wisconsin, the lakes and the water quality is a problem. And then the farming. It's largely an agricultural challenge where the winters are shorter and more extreme on both sides of the, warmth and extreme cold. And so the winters are problematic. That affects when the crops start to grow and affects the soil quality and all sorts of things. And so there's some overlap there, but they're almost completely different, right? I mean, there's almost zero overlap in terms of the actual issues. And so that makes the solutions a lot more difficult. But I think the Great Lakes is a great case study for why you can get local support. I grew up near Green Bay in a smaller town called Appleton, and you weren't allowed to swim in Green Bay growing up because it was so dirty. And paper and manufacturing facilities were just dumping waste into the lake, and all the fish had died, and all anybody who swam in there would be at risk. And now the beaches are packed with people. It took about 10 years to figure that out. The water's clean, the water's clear. It's amazing. And it's because local groups in partnership with the state and the federal government worked on it together. And then they also worked with the companies. They didn't say, companies, you got to shut down. You guys suck. You're the worst. Go away. It was like, no, you guys got to uphold some standards here. You can't just dump your waste in the river, but we're going to allow you to continue to succeed and employ the people in this community. And because there's also a lot of benefits of these like bad people, right? Like they are employing people, they're giving people their livelihoods, right? They're giving people the ability to retire and feed their families and send their kids to schools and stuff. So putting them as the villain is not what happened. So that's a great case study as to how you can do things nationally. And there's plenty of others, but that is a very different case study than what would happen in Arizona, where now Arizona actually has about 100-year water supply, despite having a water crisis long-term past 100 years, because they built the best water infrastructure below the subsurface and around with some canals of anywhere in the world. So you have Middle Eastern countries and California and Nevada and other dry places saying, Arizona, what did you do? How did you do it? And then now they're a model. But similar to Wisconsin and the Great Lakes, they helped solve that challenge by having local community NGOs, federal involvement, state involvement. And then they also had a lot of corporate involvement as well. There are private corporations that manage the canal system here in Arizona to transfer the water from the rivers to Phoenix in a really sustainable way. So there's ways to get around these challenges, but it's led locally and it's got a lot of partnerships along the way, and it's not pitting people as the enemy in the process that probably have a reason, a very valid reason for doing what they're doing. They just could be doing it better.
When you come into a new area where you maybe don't know the local politics, how do you begin? Do you start by listening for a while before you start to interject? How do you start a conversation?
Yeah, I mean, I think first you start by, before you listen, which is that's the meat of it, honestly. But the intro to that is you need to explain why you have the same outcome and what your ideal end goal is. Because when you align on that from the get-go, you open up a layer of trust, right? Like, I'm trying to figure out how to solve the water problem in Arizona without screwing over industry, without screwing over the local population. And I want to hear out what you think we can do to make that happen. So it's not just like, hey, I want to listen without context. It's like, no, we are on the same page. I'm here to figure out how we can get to the solution together. And we actually share the same end outcome. And what's really interesting is, like, and I get a lot of heat for this, honestly, but I work with a lot of really unlikely bedfellows who are seen as the enemy. I work with mining companies, and I work with oil and gas companies, and I work with nuclear companies, and I also work with solar and wind companies, and I also work with Native American tribes, and all these people who are usually opposed to each other. And they actually don't like that I work with each other, right? But when you sit down with a mining company or you sit down with a tribe, you actually can figure out a compromise there that works to support the local tribe, which might be affected by the mining company, and support the mining company, which is mining for materials for a reason, right? It's not like they're just mining to screw over the tribe. They're mining because we want it for our cell phones, or we want it for our solar panels, or we want it for something. So why don't we figure out a way to move forward that works a little bit for both, so that we don't just end up hurting both in the process? Okay, so there's going to be a mine near a Native American tribe. How can we make sure that there are processes in place to support healthy water quality? How can we get the native tribal members to have high-paying jobs, maybe at the mine, right? How can we make sure that if we're taking some environmentally sensitive land to mine, that we actually buy up double the amount of land somewhere else and protect that somewhere else, so that we actually have a net positive impact on the environment? Okay, great. Now, the mine isn't perfect, right? It's not ideal necessarily, but now we have double the amount of protected land. We have local tribal members who have high-paying jobs, and we have ensured healthy water quality. And so the mine might have to pay more because they had to buy that land, right? They have to ensure the healthy water quality, whatever, but they at least get to mine, right? And the tribal community gets high-paying jobs and at least gets to ensure that they have healthy water quality. So there's a way to do this, and I think we just are so good in 2025 of talking past each other, because it's all about sound bites and one-liners and things that we want to use as attacks towards one another, when actually there's a way to move forward on this. And it all starts with aligning on the same end goal. And then you listen, and then you figure out where the priorities overlap.
Do you train people, bring them along with you? Because what you're talking about takes a lot of effort, this is hard work, and you have to have your emotions in check. It's a lot to do. Talk a little bit about just sort of bringing leaders along with you as as you yourself as a leader.
Yeah, we do a lot of trainings, and honestly, we're all still learning, and I'm learning more every time I have these conversations. It is like an evolutional process, and what I always say is, like, they're in the moment. A lot of times the conversations can be really heated, and I mean, this is true in our personal lives too, right? You get in an argument, or you get in a debate with your partner or your friend or your mom and dad or whatever. The worst thing you can do is move away from that and then think that you were right and just be like, screw that person. It's like, okay, maybe analyze and process what just happened, the conversation that just happened. Was there some strands from their argument that you can take with you that you can learn from, even if you don't agree with 100%? Like, what's something you can reflect on that might be true from what they said, even after it's over? Because not every conversation, when you're trying to align on the same end goal, is going to go perfectly. I've been in rooms where the first few conversations are really rough between these unlikely stakeholders. But as long as they go home at the end of the conversation and they think about maybe why X party said what they said, and maybe that there's some reasoning for that, then they can come back with a little more context and understanding for the next conversation. And if both sides do that, the next conversation is way better. So There is a lot of training that we do with especially our top leaders who are kind of in these conversations on a day-to-day basis, but there is no perfect way to do it. And honestly, emotion is good. It means that you're being a little bit transparent. You don't want to hold things back, but you also can't just be out there and emotional and then not reflect. And I think society is so like, oh, I'm going to get angry at this person. I'm going to tweet, or I'm going to yell, or I'm going to debate. And then I'm going to take my ball and go home and say, screw them, and even be more against them than I was before. But I think if we could, as Americans, kind of shift our thinking to, okay, I disagreed with them, we went at it. Was there anything in there that I should learn from their perspective, even though I might be angry at them or whatever? I think that's an important process to think about.
We did some work in South Dakota at a neutrino detector. It's like a mile down in an old, crinkly, very claustrophobic kind of elevator that takes you down there. But what struck me about it was that on the way there, you pass these mountains that have been totally sheared off. They were sheared off 100 years ago, and they'll be sheared off forever. Nothing will ever grow on them because you're just on the stone now. How do we protect against that kind of devastation where we don't necessarily know the repercussions of something we might do? There's so many Superfund sites that need to be cleaned up that I don't think ever will be. But how do we come up with a culture that prizes that?
I think that's the million, billion, $1 trillion question, which is that we are so over consuming resources compared to what we actually need. And that's not a very popular argument because people want to have what they want to have. And so I don't know what the answer is to changing human behavior, but we need the resources that were in that mountain. And the problem is there's often no better way to get them. They're in these precious places. And so, what I used to think was whenever I used to pass a clear-cut forest or a mine or whatever, I would get legitimately depressed. Like, it would give me stomach pain. And then I learned that, yes, I don't want that. But when that doesn't happen where I see it, it happens somewhere else. The demand for forest products or the demand for minerals that reside in mountain areas, right, that are below the surface or on the mountain itself, that's going to be found somewhere else then. And so the answer isn't, okay, we can't use timber, or we can't use lithium, or we can't use these resources. The answer is, how do we be more resourceful in how we use them? How can we recycle them more productively? How can we not be over consuming everything all the time? Do we really need to be purchasing everything that we're purchasing on a day-to-day basis? And that's a tougher national, international behavioral change question. But I do think that we live in a world where people have this fallacy that, I think I just got attacked falsely for being supportive of mining in the boundary waters in Minnesota, which I'm not supportive of. But the reason why people want to mine there is not because they want to destroy the boundary waters. It's because we need some resources near the boundary waters that they don't really have elsewhere in the US. And so if you don't do it here, then it's being done somewhere else that's very environmentally sensitive around the world. Who chooses which one's right or wrong?
Yeah.
Right. That's the tough thing. And so I used to believe in this fallacy that all these things were inherently bad. But I'm living in a house right now where behind me you can see wood paneled, cupboards, right? That came from some tree somewhere, right? And we all on this phone, this came from, minerals somewhere, some way. So it's in Africa, or it's in China, or it's in the US, or it's somewhere. So the answer isn't how do we stop that? Because it's not going to stop. It never will unless we completely stop living the lives that we live. The answer is, how can we be smarter about doing it? And how can we be less resource intensive in everything that we do? And I do think Amazon is a huge problem. I think this we can get anything in 2 days and it's really going to be crappy and it's not going to last very long, but it's going to be cheap and it's going to be super plasticky and it's going to be made from probably slave labor or really low paid, people. And that resource is coming from somewhere, right? And we have to be thinking about that. And I like that we're thinking about that with our food, but I don't think that we're thinking enough about that with all the other products that we're using on a day-to-day basis.
Yeah, you're right. Somehow the food story, at least people think about it. Not everybody has the ability to eat in a way farm to table or whatever, but it's become more in the consciousness, but you're 100% right. The travesty of Amazon and getting everything all the time, all at once, it's whenever you want it. I mean, the devastation that does just on a tree from the packaging. I mean, it's just going to take a lot of conversation and getting people, as you do, sort of on both sides, if you will, politically. And I think the power that you're showing is that you are coming from a conservative place, which is you are thinking thoughtfully, conservatively about all these sides of the issues. And it's really interesting. So to have more people like yourselves kind of be out there having conversations, I think is going to be part of it.
I appreciate that, and I agree. And that is going to be a huge part of our message. And, to make nature nonpartisan, which is what the organization I titled is after, right? Making the environment a nonpartisan, non-polarizing issue, again, so that we can actually get good results for our planet. That is the end goal, but we are all affected by these things equally-ish, right? Like, of course, lower income people are disproportionately affected, and there are definitely communities, but overall, like, no matter our politics, we're affected the same. And so we all have a huge stake in this. And at some point, we got to stop taking from the planet so much. And there is a dire consequence of that. And honestly, I will say this. I used to be really anxious about climate change too. I'm more anxious about how quickly we're depleting the planet of its physical resources than I am about climate change. I'm more anxious about how little nature we have left. I'm more anxious about how little wild space and wildlife we have left. That will come to bite us before climate change does. Because if we don't have an ecosystem that thrives, if we don't have forests that are healthy, if we don't have communities that have the ability to have green spaces, if we don't have the ability to get outside in a healthy way where our forests are on fire every summer, of course, climate change is having an impact on that. But, we're starting these fires because cars break down and people are throwing, fireworks and, whatever. Like, we're starting these most of the time, these fires. If we deplete all of the resources that we have, and I'm exaggerating, so we're not going to deplete all of them, but we're depleting them at a very rapid pace. Part of that is consumption of resources from Amazon and all the behavior that we have on a day-to-day basis. And some of it's just us being really careless. Part of it's also us growing population-wise into the environment. If we're not careful about that, we're going to have some really serious damages. But what's really, I think, the most optimistic part of that is that is really personal, visceral, community-led to solve those challenges. It's easier to get people to rally behind because people want healthy forests, people want clean water, they want wildlife to be abundant, they don't want forest fires, even more than they don't want carbon emissions in the atmosphere they can't see. So I think we can change this, but we have to stop seeing it through a partisan lens. We have to stop seeing it through a political lens because it is breaking us. We only have so much and we all share it together. And if everyone loves national parks and everyone's going to these public lands every summer and the visitation's at an all-time high and Yellowstone's the most popular show and everyone cares about watching the docuseries Planet Earth and taking their kids to aquariums and zoos to see animals because wildlife is so amazing, then we should probably stand together to protect that place because that's what we have. There's nothing more. And that worries me more than climate change, but it also is something that I think we can rally around to protect.
You talked about forest fires. Forest fires can occur because we don't clean up the forest. We don't have natural burns. So it grows out of control, and then you have all this underbrush that eventually catches on fire. How do we stop a problem like that? Because it does require wisdom that doesn't seem like it's around at the moment,
Well, look, I think tribes should be at the center of a lot more of how we think about conservation because they've done it for centuries. It's amazing how the technology of today has not even come close to being as effective as old traditional native practices are. And so we could really learn a lot from the ways that tribes took care of their forests in the past. And now they don't have the ability to because the government tells them that they can't. But there's so much active management and proactive work that can be done to protect the environment, right? You could restore wetlands across the country. Like, wetlands are depleted at, I think, over 80% of wetlands have been destroyed, 90% of grasslands, 99% of prairies. If you restore those places, the natural disasters become less negative on the community. They're still going to come and they're still going to have a negative impact, but you will lessen the damage because you have these natural ecosystems blocking the damages. If you take care of your forests proactively, if you do some small burns in areas that people don't like because it still creates the smoke and it still looks like it's burning and whatever. I mean, I remember last year I was in Arizona. I was like, oh my gosh, there's a forest fire. This is so bad. And then I looked it up and because I could see the smoke and it was a prescribed burn. And everyone was like, this is horrible. Don't do prescribed burns. Like it's affecting our air quality. I'm like, well, I'd rather have one day of bad air quality than 10.
Yeah.
And that's the trade-off that people have to understand. But that's proactive management. It's proactive restoration. Whether that's with forests or wetlands or grasslands, we have the ability to go in and protect our communities from the worst of these disasters ahead of time. And I do feel like our society is so reactive, right? We're like, yeah, well, it's kind of kicking the can down the road. I mean, you can see that with our national debt or really any issue, right? We're just like, oh, we'll handle that later. Forest management, yeah, it's important. We'll handle that later. But then when a forest fire happens, we're like, shoot, now we have billions of dollars of damages that we need to do something about. And we could have put in a couple $100 million just to prevent that from happening in the first place. And then people wouldn't have lost their homes. People wouldn't have lost their lives. The wilderness wouldn't be destroyed. We would have only had a little pocket of it that we managed better that would have been destroyed. And the whole, region wouldn't have been. So I think we have a real opportunity to shift the culture of reactive environmentalism to proactive environmentalism and saying, what are the problems that could happen that we know happen every summer, right? Forest fires are going to happen. Hurricanes are going to happen. Floods are going to happen. How do we proactively mitigate the worst of those damages by investing in nature? It's a really, it's a winning argument. And I think if we could stand together and understand that as Americans and get some good policies on that, it would really make a meaningful difference.
You go to Scotland and the houses are 1,000 years old, or not 1,000 years old, but they're like 300 or 400 years old. They're made of stone. And then you came to Los Angeles, it's all urban sprawl where the buildings are designed to last exactly the day of the loans, and then they disappear, and we just have whatever you want to call it, sprawl. So how do we get ahead? That requires forethought to think like, well, we need to make a sustainable building that stays here and it's here for a long time because one person pays for it and then people keep paying for it, and that builds equity in the community. How do we get to some of these wise points?
Well, I think that's the beauty of some of the conversations about architecture that are happening nationally is people do want to look at nicer buildings, and there's always like memes about Europe versus the US. It'll be like US will be like the McDonald's and the Les Schwab tire and the Burger King and the Exxon gas station. It's like, this is our beauty. And then you look at like the buildings in Europe and you're like, okay, wow, there's something missing here. And I don't think we need to build buildings that are that magnificent and probably that expensive, right? In today's terms, they were largely built for palaces and kings. But like you said, homes, like they've lasted for a very long time. And it is a slightly more expensive upfront cost than building these cheap plasticky homes, but you don't have to tear them down every 5 years because they suck. And I think it's also something that both sides could rally behind because that's not a political issue either. And I think about that with clothes too, right? Like I try to wear clothes from high school, middle school even, and people want new clothes all the time and they want new products all the time, but they don't last very long. And then we just toss them. And also I drive around this neighborhood that I live in. The newer houses are so ugly. They're just so ugly. And the old homes are like, this is gorgeous. And then they tear them down to build these new ugly homes. And I think, and this goes back to the behavioral pattern that is just something that over time is going to change, hopefully, which is that people want to kind of relish in history and be a part of something that lasts a long time. And it's not just a quick hit like, oh, we built this home for 5 years and then we don't have any personal attachment to it. We don't actually really like it. There's no character to it. There's no personality to it. It just does the job. What about having meaning with where you live, right? What about having meaning with the place that you work and the building that it's in? And that's also a culture shift. And I do think the younger generation is more open to that, specifically Gen Z, of just kind of not wanting to have everything be as boring and Airbnb looking as maybe the millennial generation was or is. And I think it's, again, goes back to that behavioral change that is going to happen over time. But I even look at Asia, and they're doing the same thing. They've built some of the most beautiful structures in history, probably the most beautiful structures in history, arguably. And they are also embracing this like very cheap, build it quick model. And it's largely because of their growing population. But now that America's population is stabilizing a little bit, maybe we could start to invest more in our infrastructure and architecture for the long game rather than just doing it to try to do it quickly.
After doing this for a while, do you have friends that are progressive and your politics never come up now that you've been working together for a while?
Oh, I mean, most of my friends are, I would say, probably evenly liberal and conservative. But yeah, I mean, my girlfriend's liberal, my sisters are liberal, and there are three of my best friends, the sisters and my girlfriend, right? So it's like, I don't care. Like, I truly do not care. And I lived in Seattle for 7 years, and all my friends there were liberal, as you might imagine. Almost all my friends growing up in Wisconsin were conservative. All really, I think that's also why I inform my beliefs the way that I inform them, which is that I know when you get out of your echo chamber that people are just people and they end up wanting the same things. And so politics doesn't get brought up because why? You know, like if you're on a hike, just enjoy the hike together. If you're watching a game, just enjoy the game together. If you're having dinner together, just enjoy the freaking food together, right? Like, we're humans at the end of the day. And yeah, we might not agree on policy or politics, but that's the other thing is like people over exaggerate how much politics should be in our lives, right? Like, we think because my dad supports this policy, your dad's one voter. Like, he's not dictating the outcome of abortion policy in the United States. And you might disagree with him on something. And you might think that belief is evil or whatever. But that doesn't mean that he is a bad person, right? Like, and that he's dictating X, Y, or Z. And I think we just because somebody voted for X, that means that they're bad. But it's like, let them just check that box at the ballot drop-off counter and move on. Like, you can try to talk about it and have healthy debate and talk about, especially before an election, you know, why you should vote for different candidates and all that stuff. And I think that civic process is still really important. But when you write off people because of their political beliefs, you're closing off a lot of knowledge and a lot of opinion that you probably need to hear. And B, you're closing off an entire wealth of individuals that could positively impact your life. Liberals have been just as amazing in my life as conservatives, and I don't really care what someone's belief is. And it doesn't impact how I date them, doesn't impact how I love them, doesn't impact how I act around them. We're all just literally people at the end of the day that actually end up wanting a lot of the same things and sometimes have different ways of getting there.
Amazing. Can you just, for people who are interested, you know, ways to get involved in what you're doing? You have the organization that you started, just a little bit. So hopefully people from different perspectives might be interested to find out more how to work together.
Well, we've launched Nature is Nonpartisan earlier this year. You can go to NINP.org, natureisnonpartisan.org as well, to find out what we're doing. We're going to be launching very soon a national campaign to rally America around really big environmental ideas, conservation ideas called United by Nature this fall. So if you sign up on natureisnonpartisan.org, you can be a part of that. We're going to have community events. We're going to have concerts. We're going to have national advocacy drives. We're going to have really unlikely stakeholders standing together, lots of educational content, and we'll be launching that program in November. So natureisnonpartisan.org. We're also on social media. I'm on social media at Benji Backer. But I also think, you know, there's so many good, I want to just give a plug for whatever your local conservation org is, work with them. I love the Nature Conservancy. I love National Park Foundation. I love these national groups. But if you're in the Midwest, join your Great Lakes Conservation Group. You know, if you're in South Florida, join the Everglades Foundation, right? Like, join these local groups because they're the ones making that difference despite politics being so broken. And our goal with our national movement that we're trying to launch, which is our goal is to have 1 million Americans actively telling their politicians to take action on these issues across the political spectrum in the next couple of years. To get to that national action, we don't have to build towards national action at the local level. We already have what it takes to make those things happen. We just need more voices and more allies. So while we're waiting for the national politics to get better and working at that, which that's what I'm working on every single day, there's so much opportunity in our local communities and they need people more than ever. So natureisnonpartisan.org, your local conservation groups, and I'm on social media at Benji Backer as well.